I'm David Mills. We're going to go straight into this talk by Sonia, who's going to be talking about her upcoming book project, or at least in-process book project, Diversity in Pieces, The Fallen Future of Affirmative Action in Multiracial America. And as I was saying, this is an incredibly important and topical area right now, given what's happening, as we all know, within the Trump administration. But this also has a longer history as well. And these are not things simply that reserved for the US system, where they are concerns that all of us face around how, in a widening access environment, we continue to make progress with sexual mobility. So, Sonia, the screen and the room is all yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, David. I have, just to check the last technical thing, I've left myself on mute to try and minimize echo, but I trust everyone in the room can hear me. And people online, can you also hear as well? I'm actually looking to see where I can. Yes, much better. I think everyone is.
That was for him though.
Oh, that was earlier. Can someone just say like thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yeah, good.
Great, excellent. Okay, then I will leave things as is. David, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to all of you for joining this afternoon, and for those of you online as well. As David said, my name is Dr. Sonia Keeble. I am visiting here at Oxford for 2 terms. I'm normally based in Berlin. And while I've been here at Oxford, I've had the real privilege of having some time to think about my book manuscript, which is currently entitled Diversity in Pieces, The Fallen Future of Affirmative Action in Multiracial America. This is a particularly dynamic time in diversity politics in the United States, as many of us know. So if you'll indulge me, I've really taken this opportunity to think about some framing and very practically actually think about the title of my book. So I hope that we can kind of engage and think about some of these themes together. But just to start our conversation, advance my slides. Here we go. I trust that everyone recognizes this figure. This is former Vice President Kamala Harris. And just for anyone in the room, virtual or online, there are no wrong answers, but how would you describe Vice President Harris's racial background? Indian? African American? Anyone online, feel free to also pitch in.
Mixed.
Mixed? Okay, so we have Indian, we have African American, we also have mixed. And if you were to represent her racial identity, if we had a pie chart in front of us, where would you place her? In which category? Other?
She's mixed, she's biracial.
Biracial, okay, so in a biracial category. Okay, so there's no wrong answers here. I just wanted to have us start thinking about how we might classify an identity like Vice President Harris's. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as the talk continues. But an identity or multiracial identity like Vice President Harris's is becoming much more common in the United States. Individuals have been able to identify with multiple race categories since the 2000 census. And today, the multiracial demographic is the fastest growing youth population in the United States. So just as an example, today, 1 in 6 babies are born to parents of different races. This graph here on the left is from the Pew Foundation. It's a little bit outdated actually from here, but it shows the proportion of multiracial babies. So you can see on the West Coast in particular, about 1 in 5 babies are now multiracial. So this is a really growing demographic. And in part because of when the census categories or the census protocols changed, but also because of changing racial dynamics and increasing rates of interracial marriage, the demographic is also disproportionately young. So the median age of a multiracial individual in the United States is about the age of a college applicant, about 17 to 19. And yet what you'll find is, despite the fact that individuals have been able to identify as multiracial for over 25 years at this point, or just about 25 years, there is not a standard way in which mixed race identities are represented by colleges and universities. And I'm drawing on Carly Ford and her colleagues' work here, and just showing you kind of a brief smattering of the different kinds of strategies colleges use in trying to think about how to represent a mixed race identity. So just very quickly, and I think you can see my cursor here, if you compare This left-hand figure, this is from MIT. They've taken the strategy of double counting mixed race identities. So someone like Kamala Harris would count as both Black and Asian American. So those figures add up to more than 100%. You can see that they note as such. And I won't make you do the math, but here in this figure in the middle, this is from UC Davis. All of those figures add up to exactly 100%. So if there are no multiracial college students at the University of California at Davis, and given that previous slide, there are a lot of multiracial individuals in California, I think that's quite unlikely. What UC Davis has done is reallocated those with a mixed identity into one of these other categories. You also see here a kind of aggregate strategy. So here, I believe this is Boston College, they've created this term AHANA, which describes African American, Hispanic, Asian, and Native Americans, and together they are 30% of the student body. So someone like Kamala would certainly fall into that red slice. My mom is Asian American, my father is a white German man. I'm not sure if I would count in that red slice or not. And then finally, you have here, I believe this is from NC State. They note that 30% of their incoming freshman students are diverse. They actually include a multiracial category, but we don't know actually who comprises that 30% based off of this figure. So I open with this kind of experiment to illustrate two different points. So one is, when it comes to depicting diversity, there is really not a great consensus in terms of how to represent mixed race identities. So if you are a mixed race college student applying to college in the United States, even though you are allowed to identify with multiple race categories, there's a lot of ambiguity as to how your identity might be represented by colleges. And by extension, I would say there's probably also some questions about how your identity is accounted for in policies like affirmative action. The other point I want to make with these slides here, or with these figures here, and what other scholars have argued, is that diversity has really become a kind of symbol of prestige. It's a form of legitimacy for colleges now. And the fact that the multiracial identity has this kind of flexibility and ambiguity has been an affordance to colleges and universities in helping them appear more diverse. So a more critical view of this would be that those who are part white and part non-white all get reclassified as non-white to increase the perceived diversity of the university. So I'm testing out a title, as I noted. So diversity in pieces, I want to argue, has two meanings, and we've come to the first, which is, how does diversity accommodate multiracial identities, which are often classified in kind of pieces? I'm half Black, I'm half white, I'm 3/4 Asian and 1/4 Hispanic, for example. So how does diversity accommodate this growing demographic? Now, in order to answer this question, I want to argue that there are actually multiple definitions of diversity floating around, and I want to go ahead and define them. And so to do that, I'm going to just have us walk through a brief overview of where affirmative action originated in the United States and where it is today. So David was saying this is something that the United States has been thinking about for quite some time. So affirmative action was first introduced in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy. The term was really introduced in the wake of the Jim Crow era during the civil rights movement, and it was an explicit acknowledgement of the need for intentional corrective action to those legacies of discrimination and systemic injustice in the United States. Since JFK introduced the initiative, that actually expanded under both Democratic and Republican leadership. So not only, it originally started as targeting African Americans, but that would eventually expand to include other ethnic minorities, to include women, those with disabilities. Richard Nixon actually instituted the use of quotas and asked institutions to share with the government their timeline for how they were going to diversify their workforce. So this continued for about 15 years. Inevitably, or perhaps unsurprisingly, there was a lot of pushback to these initiatives. And so in the late 1970s, things started to change. So whereas in the 1960s and into the 70s, we really saw diversity and the use of affirmative action as a means of social justice, as a corrective to legacies of injustice, we see things start to shift with a landmark Supreme Court decision, Regents of University of California v. Bakke. And in that Supreme Court case, the University of California was sued by a white man named Alan Bakke, who alleged that he had been discriminated against because of the use of affirmative action. And in this court case, the court was split. The conservatives argued that the use of affirmative action was illegal and it was in fact discriminatory. It violated the Equal Rights Amendment, whereas the more left-wing side of the court declared that this was still an important practice, that racial inequality was still persistent. And Justice Powell ended up compromising these two different sides of the courts insofar that he declared the use of racial quotas illegal. So the University of California could no longer reserve slots specifically for racial minorities. But he also declared that colleges could still pursue diversity as an element of their admitted class because diversity, he argued, was seen as educationally beneficial. He said that meeting individuals with different backgrounds from yourself, with different lived experiences, created a richer learning environment. And for that reason, colleges could still pursue a diverse class as long as they weren't using racial quotas. And this became known as the diversity rationale. So instead of a legal justification that thought about diversity and affirmative action as a social justice initiative, it had turned into an educational benefit. And that ended up being the only legally defensible use of affirmative action in college admissions and hiring practices as well for close to 50 years. So this withstood a number of Supreme Court challenges. In the early 2000s, there were 2 levied against the University of Michigan. Then in the mid-2010s, there were 2 levied against the University of Texas at Austin. And in all of these cases, the diversity rationale stood, but the reach of affirmative action ended up becoming a little bit hemmed in each time. So in the early 2000s, bonus points were deemed illegal. And Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said that affirmative action was still needed at this point in time, but she estimated that in about 25 years, so about now, we would no longer need affirmative action, and that racial equality should have been achieved at that point with the use of affirmative action. In Fisher v. Texas, the diversity rationale still stood, so colleges were still allowed to practice affirmative action. But the courts essentially put them on notice and they said, you need to demonstrate that you're also seeking diversity in other ways beyond just using affirmative action. Now, of course, we live in a very different landscape now. In 2023, in the case Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard and the University of North Carolina, the diversity rationale was overturned. And therein, the Supreme Court argued that the diversity rationale was not legally defensible, it was unconstitutional, and that colleges could no longer account for student race as given by a checkbox in their admissions decisions. And so in this sense, the way that race-based affirmative action had been practiced for 50 years was no longer legal. So now the one caveat, I guess, the Supreme Court gave was that universities could still account for students' lived experiences, which may implicate their racial identity, but offering a racial identity was no longer permissible. So now the second meaning that I'm playing with in this title is that I'm arguing that I'm writing this book in the wake of affirmative action having been overturned, and that has really left one of the main arms or main diversity initiatives in pieces. So part of this book is also to kind of diagnose how did we get here and where do we go from here. Now, I also took you on this little history lesson for a moment because the evolution of the legal definition of diversity also, I want to argue, kind of fractured the definition of diversity in higher education. So there are different definitions of diversity floating around. And one, again, it started as a form of justice. It was supposed to be a way of recognizing historical injustices and mitigating systemic inequality. It turned into an educational good. And there's a lot of empirical research that backs this up. Diverse groups are better problem solvers, they're better critical thinkers. It does reduce racial animosity. It creates a more civically engaged populace. So there are quite a lot of benefits that come from having a diverse population. But as I opened with, and in thinking about the categorization of multiracial individuals, it had also become a symbol of prestige and a kind of organizational commodity. And as Hamilton and Nielsen argue, diversity has ended up becoming really about what they call the shallow representation of underrepresented groups. So now to think about the kind of two different meanings of my book title in tandem, if we're thinking about these different definitions of diversity and where multiracial applicants fit in, we can think about if diversity is a form of justice, then do multiracial individuals experience some kind of injustice or systemic inequality that is worthy of recognition? as an educational good? Do multiracial individuals contribute some kind of new form of diversity, new experiences, new perspectives that enrich the learning environment? And if we're thinking about it as a symbol of prestige and thinking about the representation of underrepresented groups, do we consider multiracial individuals to belong to underrepresented groups? So putting these different pieces together, their kind of research question or the drive of this talk is to think about how multiracial applicants and their families discern the boundaries of diversity in US selective college admissions. Now, in terms of trying to understand all of that, applicants and their families need to understand holistic review, which is a very ambiguous evaluation process. So I see some nods here. I know I have some Americans in the room. So this is a very opaque evaluation system that prioritizes the evaluation of the whole applicant. So that can mean their grades, their test scores, but it also means their interview, what they write about in their personal essays, their extracurricular activities, for example. People have also talked about the whole application or the whole pool, but the idea is that there's no one factor that determines how an application is evaluated. This provides a lot of opacity and a lot of cover for universities and how they describe their evaluation processes, so they can be forthcoming that diversity is something that they care about, which for a long time was legally permissible, but they never had to disclose how or to what degree or to what extent diversity was playing a role. And of course, decision-making processes are very fiercely guarded. We have very little empirical evidence of this, the last being Mitchell-Stevens' ethnography in the early 2000s. So I want to argue that when multiracial applicants and their families are thinking about applying to college, they're engaging in something that I call identity appraisals. And what I mean by that is that they're thinking about the meanings and values that are assigned to their identities when they apply to college. So they're thinking about questions like, do I count for diversity? And if so, if I can get my slide to extend, how much? And what does my identity mean to colleges and universities? How much is it worth? And I'm using the term appraisal very purposefully because it has two different meanings. It means an assessment. College admissions is inherently an evaluative setting, right? People are saying, is this a good student? Is this a bad student? Is this a competitive applicant or not? But it also means an estimate or a value of worth. And as you'll see, hopefully in the data, applicants and their families are very much thinking about their identities in terms of value or worth. So to better understand this, I embarked on a longitudinal interview study. I recruited multiracial families from the Bay Area in 2021 to the 2022 admissions cycle. This was the penultimate admissions cycle where race-based affirmative action was still legal. So I'm memorializing one of the last cycles where race-based affirmative action was still at play, with the Supreme Court case looming. So this was a time when there was a lot of talk about race-based affirmative action, a lot of emphasis on diversity. It was also in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. So this was a time where there was a lot of talk in the air about diversity and affirmative action. This entails a total of 75 interviews with college applicants and their parents. For the purposes of time, I haven't discussed as much my decision to focus on families, but I'm happy to talk about that at the end of the talk. And I'm giving here a very brief overview of the sample. You can see it comprises a number of different kinds of multiracial identities. So I was not, the purpose here is not to try and say a Black-white identity is appraised in this way versus an Asian-white one, but to think about kind of collectively, as a group, multiracial applicants are all faced with the same kind of ambiguity of their classification and appraisal, and I want to think about that kind of collectively. Happy to talk a little bit more about the sample if there are any questions at the end of the talk. I'm going to walk you through 3 different family portraits to show you how these identity appraisals function and also how they end up informing action. So I'll tell you about the Adamsons, who really see a multiracial identity as a kind of liability. It features Annie and her mother, Evelyn. Annie attends a private high school, but she is on scholarship. She's one of the few low-income students at her high school. And her mother, Evelyn, is Mexican, and she did not finish college. So they're a bit of an anomaly in a fairly middle class, upper middle class, and college-educated sample. We then have the Campbells, who come to a different conclusion and see multiracial as an asset. It features Clara, who identifies as Asian and white. They come from an upper middle class background, and Melissa identifies as Eurasian. Both of her parents graduated from an elite university, and they Clara attends a private high school. And then finally, I'll tell you about the Bakers, who see a multiracial identity as irrelevant. It features Quincy, who identifies as Black and white. He has a father, Brad, who is a Black man who graduated from an Ivy League institution, and he also attends a private school. I've chosen these 3 cases because they show the breadth of the sample in terms of showing different kinds of racial identities. It also shows a breadth in terms of socioeconomic standing, but they also have some important similarities insofar that they are all attendees of private high schools, and they are all part white, and they're thinking about their white aspect of their identity in different ways. So first, Annie and Evelyn really are thinking about a multiracial identity as a liability. And Evelyn thinks about this very much insofar that she's had her own experiences in private high schools in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she feels like she's had to really put on a very caricatured performance as a Mexican-American woman at her child's high school. So she says it's a dog and pony show. I have to be as Mexican as possible, but it's a certain kind of image of Mexican, not a scary kind, not a gang member, but enough so that schools have their street cred. So she's learned by her estimation that there is a specific performance that is expected of her and that colleges are seeking in their applicants. And based off of that lived experience, she advises her daughter to eliminate the white part of her identity when she applies to college and only identify as Hispanic. Annie identifies very much as multiracial. She has a lot of multiracial friends at her school, but she ultimately adopts this advice from her mother, but for a slightly different reason. So she says, well, a lot of my friends, they're paying full tuition. And that's not something that they're really thinking about. They're not thinking about tuition bills. So they can check off their white side. She says, but for me, I need to get these different kinds of scholarships. I need to qualify for financial aid. So if she's applying for a scholarship for women of color in STEM, for example, whereas her friends don't need to think about that, they don't really need to check off those identity boxes as much. So for her, there is a real imposition here of the kind of identity performance that she feels like she needs to offer in order to qualify for financial aid to even be able to afford college. And so for her, the kind of appraisal that she and her mother go through are really thinking about her racial identity and her class identity in tandem. And it informs very much the opportunities that she applies for and also how she ends up representing her identity on her application. We can contrast Annie's experience with the Campbells, so Melissa and Clara here. And so here I highlight this quote from Melissa, and she's thinking a little bit about the multiracial identity in a different way. So whereas Annie and her mother really thought about that multiracial identity as kind of a diluted form of diversity that would end up costing them, Melissa sees it actually as an asset. So she says, well, being counted as mixed feels to me like it could be a little bit of an advantage, whereas the individual components, in this case, Asian and white, are almost a disadvantage potentially. And this is informed by her seeing that in the Fisk college guide, so the college guide that she used to guide her daughter, she sees a multiracial category. And we know that that's fairly rare. Clara is the youngest of 3 children, so Melissa sees this for the first time in guiding her kids through college. Says, well, if Fisk is putting it out, they're touting it. So it's definitely a selling point that these colleges are putting out. So it does feel like, oh, we get to slide into the multiracial category, and implied in that is out of the Asian and white categories, even if the individual components are overrepresented. So here, Melissa is thinking about the multiracial category as a new form of underrepresented minority or a new racial category that her daughter ends up benefiting from. And so there, she really feels like identifying as multiracial is very important. Then we have Brad and Quincy, who are really thinking about their Quincy's multiracial identity as irrelevant. So Brad was quite direct with me, and he said his wife is white, and he says, well, my wife may do all of the work, but I'm the face of admissions. As I joke, I may not be able to get a cab in the rain in New York City, but this is going to get my kids into school. So he very much sees affirmative action as one of the few benefits that are afforded to Black Americans, and he's ready for his kid to take advantage of it. And this ends up creating quite a lot of tension within the family because Quincy is actually quite sure that he does not want to apply to the types of institutions that his father attended. So he does not want to apply to the Ivy League university that his father attended. He doesn't want to apply to mostly predominantly white institutions at all, and actually wants to apply only to historically Black colleges and universities. And I asked him why he said that. And he said, well, PWIs, they're trying to look diverse so that they can be more desirable. It's not necessarily so that they can have like a better community. He says, in contrast, the HBCUs, they're not really like trying to get white people to apply to HBCUs. Like diversity is not something that they're thinking about in that way. And that for him is really attractive. He talks about having been one of the few Black students in his classes in San Francisco growing up. And for him, it's really important that he seeks out a community where he is not explicitly a minority or targeted in that way. And so for him, the fact that he's mixed race is actually not important to him at all because he wants to take, as he says, race out of the equation and apply to an entirely different ecosystem. So just to give you a quick summary again of the 3 different cases that I've shown you, here we can think about not only the appraisals of each individual racial group here. So we see, for lack of a better term, I've done this into advantage and disadvantage. So we see here that Black is seen as an advantage. White in this case is seen as irrelevant. The multiracial identity is also seen as irrelevant, and diversity, at least as Quincy defines it, is really seen as desirability from the point of colleges and universities. Quite similarly, the Adamsons see diversity as a form of street cred, as Evelyn said. She sees Hispanic very much as being her only advantage that she can confer her daughter. And again, whiteness and multiracial then ends up being a disadvantage. In contrast, the Campbells see both Asian and white as potentially being disadvantaged, but the combination and perhaps a multiplicative way ends up yielding an advantage. And they're really thinking about diversity in terms of representation. So being an identifying as multiracial ends up allowing one entry into the underrepresented minority category. So in conclusion, for this study, I want to suggest that selective admissions is a really productive process. And I mean productive insofar that it's producing meanings, it's producing values and ideas about specific groups and about the idea of diversity in particular. I want to argue that multiracial applicants are especially attuned to these meaning-making processes because their identities are resistant to the existing classification schemas. And so they're having to think much more about what their identity means, how it's being represented. And so they offer a particular insight into the kind of construction of diversity as a cultural idea. And as you'll see, if we think back to those 3 logics of diversity that I opened the talk with, we don't see very much evidence of diversity as a form of justice. We also don't see a lot of evidence of diversity as a form of a kind of educational benefit. We mostly see them talking about diversity as a kind of organizational benefit, and they're really thinking about it as something that they can confer to organizations. So when we think about Annie, for example, or Evelyn in particular, that is something that they confer. Quincy feels similarly. And even Clara and her mother are thinking about diversity as something that organizations primarily benefit from, and they kind of, by a happy accident, end up fitting into that schema. So where do we go from here? And these next slides, I will kind of invite as a brainstorm because there's so much going on. And had I been presenting on this maybe 6 months ago, I would feel a little bit more declarative in some of my predictions. Right now, it feels difficult to make any kind of prediction. But I will say, even in the current climate, I'm going to argue that identity appraisals are likely to persist. They might not persist in the same kind of forms, but you can recall the Supreme Court decided that applicants are still allowed to write about experiences of race. So even if they aren't checking boxes, they might be writing essays that explicitly talk about their experiences and their racialized experiences. Some scholars have really said this has the potential of really reifying our understanding of specific racial identities as having to kind of trauma dump or kind of share experiences of discrimination. Counselors and teacher recommendations are another way in which racial identity can be communicated, perhaps in a similar manner. We could also think about extracurricular involvement or affinity groups as other ways to kind of signal racial identity, even in the absence of a race checkbox. And the Supreme Court overturned race-based affirmative action, but diversity and other forms of affirmative action or diversity are still legally permissible. So we can think about the definition of first-generation college student, nationality, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status. Those are all different dimensions of identity that are still in play in diversity. And many, I won't go through the entire literature, but a lot of scholarship has also focused on how some of these may be proxied to think about racial diversity in the absence of race-based affirmative action. Now, at the same time, the fall of affirmative action in this manner has already had very real consequences on the racial composition of elite colleges and universities. That's both a supply and demand side change. So Black and Hispanic students have already started applying to selective colleges at lower rates, and they're being admitted at lower rates as well. So you can already see this sharp decline of Black and Hispanic students at elite colleges. That was true when affirmative action was overturned at public institutions as well. So that was predicted, and that is already coming through. So if we're thinking about picking up the pieces in this current climate, do we still need affirmative action? Maybe that's one question. And I would say yes, definitively. Sandra Day O'Connor had her prediction that around now, we wouldn't need race-based affirmative action because racial inequality would be solved. I don't think that's the case in the United States by any measure. We are still a very deeply racialized and racially unequal society that has not changed in the last 25 years. And affirmative action is one of the very few tools that intervene very directly. We know from previous research that affirmative action really built the Black middle class to the extent that it exists. And is diversity still worth pursuing? Also, yes, definitively. All of that empirical research showing the benefits of diversity, those still stand. Having a more diverse learning environment does engender better critical thinking. It does engender better civic engagement, for example. All of those things are very true and are still worth pursuing. But what I want to contend is that we've asked diversity to do too much on its own. So part of the thinking here is if we just get a more diverse composition of people, then our problems are solved. And I'm being a little facetious here, but when I think about what we've asked diversity to do, eliminate racism, eliminate inequality, fix institutions and make them look good, accommodate now this growing demographic, and save democracy. I mean, these are all things that diversity has become tethered to. And in this kind of nebulous way of diversity just becoming this term that gets thrown around a lot. And so there I want to argue based off of some of what my participants have shared, that diversity has become an onus for those individuals, and it was originally intended to be a benefit. So we can think about kind of a reversal. Originally, organizations were supposed to be providing individuals with a much needed benefit, and now we see a kind of reversal where individuals are conferring a kind of benefit onto organizations. So what do we do in this moment? And here's really where I'm thinking in a kind of brainstorm. In this current administration and with the composition of the Supreme Court being what it is, I don't think affirmative action, race-based affirmative action is coming back anytime soon, at least not in the next 5 years, let's say. So what can we do instead? Well, one thing that I want to argue is that the hyper focus on racial diversity in admissions is a byproduct of a really intense and focus on elite colleges. And there's reason for that. Elite colleges are incredibly influential in the United States, but it also allowed for diversity to become a kind of an explanation for an evaluation process that's completely overloaded. I used to work in selective college admissions. When you are that constrained and working with such small parameters in terms of who you admit, it's very hard to point the finger at any one particular thing. And diversity has become kind of a convenient explanation for decisions that are really hard to explain. The one thing I would argue is that we should try and eliminate that elite focus. Social mobility doesn't have to run only through elite universities. Those elite universities are quite big engines for social mobility for those that do enter them, but there are over 4,000 universities and colleges in the United States. Only a very small fraction of them ever practice race-based affirmative action. If you're not a selective college, you're not thinking about race-based affirmative action. But we've lost a lot of open access institutions. Public institutions that were meant to educate the populace are also overrun and are dealing with severe underinvestment. Austerity measures have been in place for decades. I would argue we really need to invest in public institutions and open up those pathways. I would also say we need to create alternate routes to and through higher education. For example, we can think about streamlining and institutionalizing pathways from community college to BA, for example. I would also argue we should think about creating alternate routes to employment in the United States that doesn't have to go through higher education. Right now, we have a college for all system that's really, I think, contributed to a very saturated system. And I would also say that we need to start earlier in the educational pipeline. We've put a lot of emphasis on affirmative action during college admissions. That's one particular point that we're intervening in quite intentionally, and I would argue that's far too late. We know that inequalities are very entrenched in the United States and they begin very early in life. And by the time that we're trying to intervene when a student is transitioning to college, is far too late. So this is, as I said, a brainstorm, given the kind of dynamism is what I will say of the current political climate. So I will conclude my talk there, and thank you all for your engagement. Let me see if I can get my thank you slide. Maybe not. Well, anyway, the last slide says thank you and provides my contact information. But I would love to open it up for questions and comments, and I really hope this will be a conversation. Thank you all for your attention and look forward to the conversation.
Great, so thank you very much. So you've given us lots to think with it. It's really fascinating to get that history, but also very much to think about this contested presence. Please do post questions in the chat if those of you online and in the room can raise their hands. I'm going to start, Sonia, by just getting you to reflect on whether part of the challenge that the US created for itself was with the word diversity. because in some ways, with that first legal case in '78, where diversity became the one route by which you could do widening access, meant the focus then became on diversity and as you said, the overloading of that term. Whereas if there had been if you'd use a broader sense of a word like social mobility or widening participation or widening access, perhaps these institutions wouldn't have got so caught on trying to define diversity. Would that have changed things, or is it that all these definitions get weaponized in that sort of context?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I do think I shared that because 1978 ended up being so pivotal. Like now looking back, of course, hindsight is 2020. We overloaded that term so much that ended up having to do so much work in the courts in terms of a legal defense that it did become overly narrow. And diversity wasn't supposed to only mean racial diversity, but that was where it met the fiercest backlash. And so in that sense, diversity, even though it can mean so many different things, has really become synonymous with racial diversity. It's also, I would argue now, become synonymous with like woke, for example, as just like a general term. So yeah, I mean, maybe we could think about social mobility as something that in theory is perhaps more palatable, but I'm not sure that naming it as such wouldn't have followed the exact same path that diversity did as well. But yeah.
And I'm thinking about how it's worked in this country, perhaps widening participation has been fluffy enough that lots of people can do lots of things under it, but it hasn't been contested. I think there's a broader sense in which that's seen as a good thing, so that makes it easier. There are a couple of questions online. Can we start with Glenn and then with Ian? Yeah. Glenn, do you want to unmute and ask a question? We are going to the Pope.
Thank you. Sonia, I thought that your presentation today was rather stimulating and it got me thinking quite a bit. Okay, but I'd like to pivot my question on this recent election of Pope Leo, the American as Pope of a Catholic, religion world over. Do you think the fact that Pope Leo, being a Pope, an American, would kind of break the impasse in the political dialogue, in the kind of trends of what's happening in the United States, and would there be an expansive attitude towards DEI, for example, and to become more accommodative, more accepting of a kind of multiracial community of learners, at least in universities? What do you think, Sonia? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Glenn. So to clarify, are you asking this about Pope Leo because of his own racial background, or because he's been more forthcoming in terms of disagreeing with some of the policies that the Trump administration has put forward?
Let's start with his own background, being
Yes.
Creole and white and in part black, and what you will. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a very live question since this came out. And I didn't talk about this case in the talk today, but I have a family, and the daughter identifies as part Creole, and that ends up being quite influential for her. So I've been thinking about this case in parallel with that case in particular. I don't know if I can be so optimistic that that might kind of shift some of the tensions in the United States right now. I mean, I think there is. At first, I think there was a lot of pride in the US about having an American pope, and then among conservatives who are the most virulently opposed to DEI initiatives, when they saw that he had actually kind of disagreed with Trump on some of his policies, I think there was some reversal there. I haven't thought as much about his own racial identity, in part because I don't know how much he's talked about it. What I've seen more is his decision to not speak English when he was first announced. And that was sort of seen as potentially as kind of reneging on his American background. So I'm not sure if that will necessarily end up shifting the kind of dialogue and current state of DEI initiatives in the United States. I'm very curious, though. I mean, I haven't seen this much attention. Maybe I just wasn't paying as much attention to the last election of the Pope, but I think there's like more attention to this election this time. So in that sense, he may be a much more pivotal figure. So I'm balking a little bit, but remains to be seen.
You're not expected to give a paper on diversity and be a Vatican watcher. Thank you, Ben. That was good. We'll take one more question online and then questions in the room. Ian, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Yes, I'm talking about the UK here. So my memory, and there are so many stats, they get blurred, is that within the UK, as in the USA, the what we call mixed race applicants are increasing faster than any of the other subgroups and ethnic identities. I'm fairly sure of that. I think also that once they're in, they outperform the other groups as well. So they don't have that attainment gap that black students have. They are in fact slightly better than the white students and the Chinese students even. I don't know whether that's true in the USA. Can I say I speak as the father of an adopted mixed race child? Oh, child, she's 48 now.
She's still your kid.
Also, I'm about to retire from a university that's been committed to access and has a majority of non-white students, and a whole lot of those are mixed race, and the second highest proportion of working class students. So there's a commitment there to students who are likely to be looking for a more open access and less exclusive than many of the Ivy Group or the Russell Group universities in our two countries.
Yeah, I'm not as well positioned to speak to the mixed race population in the UK. My sense is, though, here in the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, there are more categories that accommodate a multiracial identity, right? I've seen like an Asian and white category. I've seen like a black and white category. Is that correct?
You can tick more than one box.
Yeah.
That's the point, yeah? I guess, yeah.
I want to say like when I filled out my doctor's registration form when I came here, like I was able to identify as Asian and white as one rather than tick two boxes. So I think part of the thing in the United States is that there's a lot of choice in terms of how an individual with multiple racial heritages actually ends up identifying. So I'm not sure, there isn't a ton of data actually about the kind of aggregate performance of multiracial individuals in the United States. Richard Alba has done some work on the socioeconomic standing of the mixed race group, and he's found there's a lot of heterogeneity there. So Asian and white families, for example, are some of the most socioeconomically successful among multiracial students. Whereas we see like white Black individuals are still much closer to their Black counterparts. So they're in part in the United States, I think this is part of the question of whether or not the multiracial category as a whole ends up counting for an underrepresented minority because there's so much heterogeneity in there, and because there's so much that we don't know about, honestly, in terms of educational attainment, and also in part because it's an unreliable identification. So we don't have a standard measure of representing it, but also individuals don't always identify in the same way. We've known that for decades of research, which is not to say that mixed race individuals are, like sneaky or like overly manipulative, but just that race is itself a very mutable characteristic. Our identities shift depending on the context that we're in. And multiracial individuals are especially likely to kind of be flexible in that way.
Brilliant, thank you. It's your first, yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I studied in States for a long time, and so I just like to think about that. Again, it's really cool. But it also made me think about a lot of high school shows in US, elite prep schools and all that too. But anyways, I have two questions. The first one is, I think recently I started to hear the word cognitive diversity more. Mm-hmm. And so combine that with the lived experiences you talked about. Has there been new indexes or new measurements to measure other than race or gender? Has there been other ways to measure how to measure cognitive diversity in a group that's not measured on smartness or what they contribute to the team? That's the first question. And the second one was at the last slide, there was a mention about social mobility in America and the reason why people want to go to the universities. And so it seems as if in US, the reason to go to university is social mobility. Do you agree with that? And so since you've been traveling in UK and Germany, how do you see similarities and differences in terms of that?
Great. Thank you. Let me just make sure I get all of it.
Cognitive diversity and social mobility.
Yes. And differences in the UK and in Germany. Yes. Okay. So let me just first ask for cognitive diversity. Do you mean like neurodiversity, like having different kind of like having ADHD, or do you mean in terms?
I think in a sense it's also like because you're Asian or you're Latin American, you bring different experiences. Mm-hmm. Thus you bring different ways of thinking, but the end goal is the difference in thinking, not like at first you're not defined by your races.
Oh, got it. So is the thinking like maybe people from different racial backgrounds are thinking in different ways? Their experiences actually lead them to think differently. Yeah, I haven't seen that term cognitive diversity, but that's certainly a big part of the diversity rationale is the idea that people who have different lived experiences are going to approach problems very differently and think about solving them also in very different ways. So certainly, I haven't heard that term specifically, but that's very much a part of that's part of the crux of being better problem solvers and critical thinkers is that our lived experiences inform how we end up solving problems. To your question about social mobility, yes, that is one reason I think that students are pursuing higher education. I would also say there's also, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not social stasis, but like to ensure their own social standing, right? So if you're coming from an elite background, a very quick way to ensure that you stay within that elite circle is just go to an elite university. We didn't talk about this as much in this talk, but there are a number of ways in which the admission process privileges those who are already in that elite standing. So if your parent, for example, went to an elite college, you are given a boost. And so in that way, higher education is one important access for social mobility, but it's a really important access for social reproduction as well. And finally, I would also just say, the United States has really descended into more and more of a credentialist society. So having the BA in hand is really important. There are lots of places where without a BA, you're just not employable. And it's starting to even become an MA. So there's also a kind of necessity of going to college and university at this point as well. And then in terms of differences in Germany and the UK, I mean, part of my work in Germany has really been about defining diversity. And so what dimensions of identity count for diversity in Germany. And Germany's been a really interesting case because much of their diversity initiatives are happening right now. Like it's fairly new. And so part of my work has looked at, are they borrowing from some of the schemas that are common here in the UK or in the US? Predominantly, the main axis of diversity in Germany is about gender parity. So they've had many, many more decades of having gender equality offices. And there's some tension actually between the introduction of diversity offices and how they may or may not complement gender equality offices. So there's some concern from gender equality officers that the introduction of diversity offices may actually pull resources from gender equality efforts. So there's a real kind of moment of contestation in Germany right now. And like a lot of continental Europe, the idea of thinking about race or ethnicity is much touchier. It's not nearly as salient of a topic as it is in the US and in the UK. So there's certainly some cultural and logistical challenges there in terms of thinking about diversity in Germany.
Great, thank you. Helen.
So I should come clean and admit that I ran undergraduate admissions here for 2 years.
Great. I used to work in admissions too, so
I've done these debates about Oxford, and I was fascinated by it. But I was pleased you mentioned the legacy admissions because to a certain extent, once you have a self-perpetuation like that, you've got to counteract it. But my real question was, I mean, here David said very rightly, we had a discussion before lunch about admissions and the push for widening participation, quality of access. Universities have generally tried, thought this is a good thing, other than in the extent that they say we shouldn't be having to make up for deficits in schools. But that's because there is we don't, in very large part, have quotas, and we have what we call contextual data to look at grades. But that's not but that's saying this school, as you said, it might be proxy for race, but it's about in this school nobody ever gets an A in maths. So if this person gets a B in maths, that's probably as good as getting an A in maths. Right. So to what extent, I wanted to ask, the way we fiercely guard the academic baseline of decision-making here, do you find, do the American universities push back against diversity quotas from an academic perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the tension between diversity and meritocracy or achievement is a perennial debate. I mean, it's one of the main arguments against diversity initiatives in the UK, or excuse me, in the US, certainly. I mean, that's what has driven a lot of the accusations of a DEI hire, right? That someone is less qualified because the academic standards have been lowered. I mean, these selective places are extremely challenging to get into, and the arms race to get into those colleges has only become more intense. So I still read admission files for a selective university, and I'd say, not blowing the lid, I don't think, on anything, but the standards don't like, it's not like I think there's this perception that the standards magically are just completely different in admissions, and that's not true. Like, I mean, admission officers have a duty to admit a class of students that will be successful. We don't want to set students up for failure. And so we're thinking very purposefully about academic preparation, but again, in context, and race is an important context in the United States in particular. We live in a very racially segregated society and very racially unequal society. And so we see very different opportunities and resources afforded to individuals. And it's not always a one-to-one, we don't always see it, but that certainly comes into play, right? We're thinking about, given the opportunities that the student has had, what is their achievement and what do we think will happen when they're actually on campus? Will they be successful? So in that sense, that's holistic review, I would say, at its best, is that it's allowing for that kind of contextual review while still balancing whether or not that student can be successful.
But you've still got to, but there have been numbers.
Yeah, and of course there are numbers. So yes, this is an interesting dynamic at the current moment. So I didn't talk about this, but this was test optional was still in play when I conducted this study. So the COVID-19 pandemic basically made all universities in the United States have to adopt a test optional policy because people couldn't take these tests. And so a lot of people were saying, well, now this is going to like even the playing field. And there were a lot of colleges and universities who have now started to bring back that testing. But I think there was some real reticence about bringing back testing because it could be used as legal leverage to sue universities because quantitative measures are much easier to say, well, this group has this admission rate and these SAT scores versus this one. But I would say we need to really think about how we're defining merit and whether these tests and evaluations are really neutral arbiters of ability or merit. The same thing even with GPA or tests. I mean, GPA and a student's transcript gives much more information than one standardized test, as you know, for sure. But even that is also context driven. We know from lots of sociological research about how students experience education very differently and perform very differently, interact with teachers, take up resources very differently, for example. So certainly if I had another question about do we still need holistic review, I would also very much say yes.
And one question I really want to ask you, and if I may, no, not to ask a question. Is anyone talking about what, from our perspective, seems wrong, that the existence of legacy admissions? I mean, you know, it is in a context of promoting diversity, legacy admissions seems to be absolutely opposite.
So legacy admissions has gotten a lot of pushback, and there are colleges and universities that are starting to reverse it. There are a lot that aren't as well. And I mean, I certainly have seen this happen, and I think this is basically like the best form of self-perpetuation and social reproduction. But I will say one argument that I've heard, at least about optics of legacy admissions, is we are now entering a period where, because of race-based affirmative action policies, we are now getting to the age where racial minorities who have graduated from elite colleges have children of their own who are now applying to those same colleges and would be in the position to benefit from legacy admissions. So removing it now would be like kind of a double. I don't know that that means that we shouldn't get rid of it myself, but that has been one racialized kind of aspect of legacy admissions.
Brilliant. We're getting to 3 o'clock, and so in the UK we will wrap up now. Do join us every week. Next week we're talking about inequalities in forest research, looking at global science and Tanzanian research. But we do have more sessions coming up on access, on wide participation, including a one-day workshop on the 3rd of June entitled Access and Geopolitics. So you're welcome to join us for those. Thank you all for coming in the room. Thank you for coming online. And thank you, Sonia, for a great talk.
So thank you for having me.